For people going in blind to War and Peace, the subject of the novel might seem a bit strange. Sure, the Napoleonic invasion of Russia was a massive event for both Russian and world history, but Tolstoy wrote the novel in the 1860s, which was 50 years after the war happened. While the Napoleonic Wars undoubtedly affected his life in a number of direct and indirect ways, it's easy to see how it might be considered distant from his own experiences, given that he wasn't even born until 13 years after the Battle of Waterloo. Before he wrote War and Peace, Tolstoy was already somewhat of a known author, but all of his previous books were fictionalized accounts of things that he himself had experienced, from his first trilogy of novels about childhood, boyhood, and youth, to a novella about a young woman who marries an older man, to a series of stories about his experience as an officer in the Crimean War. Napoleon was to the Russia of Tolstoy's day a distant memory, an event of incredible national importance to be sure, but one whose memory nevertheless resided firmly outside of daily consciousness. Except perhaps not, because while the invasion itself was ancient history, a number of implications of that invasion began to manifest themselves in increasingly unexpected ways. In 1825, Alexander I, the man who led Russia during the Napoleonic invasion, died unexpectedly in a backwater town called Taganrog on the Black Sea. Alexander's brother Constantine was the heir apparent, but Constantine had no desire to be Tsar and had secretly removed himself from succession 2 years earlier and now lived in Poland. The next choice was the pair's younger brother Nicholas. The whole not wanting to be Tsar thing probably wouldn't have been that big a deal, except that as mentioned, Constantine did it in secret, not expecting Alexander to die for some time. Since he was in Poland and Tsar Alexander's envoy was still in Taganrog, Nicholas, not knowing better, supported Constantine's right to the throne. By the time the mistake had been caught, the royal family found themselves in an awkward situation. Both surviving heirs had publicly supported the other to become Tsar. As the royal court scrambled to figure out how to legally get themselves out of this situation and make Nicholas the unambiguous heir to the throne, a number of officers and prominent Petersburg families took action. Since no one had stepped forward to become Tsar, the Empire of Russia was now a constitutional monarchy. Wait, what? What followed is called the Decembrist uprising. Think of it like the French Revolution, but with Nerf guns. With the familiar chant of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the would-be revolutionaries occupied a central square in St. Petersburg and demanded no less than the end of absolutism in Russia and the demotion of the Tsar to the status of a constitutional monarch, or else. Or else what? Or else they promised to continue to occupy a central square in St. Petersburg and demand no less than an end to absolutism in Russia and the demotion of the Tsar to the status of a constitutional monarch. Nicholas, in order to consolidate his power and stamp out any opposition to his rule, acted swiftly, ruthlessly, and it's generally agreed disproportionately. The ringleaders were rounded up and executed, and a number of sympathizers were exiled indefinitely to Siberia. What does this have to do with Tolstoy? Well, Nicholas ruled for a time, but in the end he died too, and his son Alexander II took power. Alexander has been seen as the most liberal Tsar of the late Russian Empire, and one of his first acts was to grant clemency to the surviving Decembrists and allow them to return from exile to St. Petersburg in 1856, over 30 years after the uprising. The Decembrists had certainly been known to Tolstoy before this point, but it wasn't until after they began to return to high society that they captured his imagination. They became a fascinating subject to him. After all, here were a group of men and their wives, many of whom accompanied them to exile, of considerable social status, with wealth, power, and influence, who nevertheless risked everything on a crazy scheme to spread republicanism. This scheme wouldn't have brought them directly much benefit, but it would have lifted up the rest of society. Why would someone do this? Risk everything not for themselves but for the sake of others and their moral convictions? Leo Tolstoy, it turns out, was in a unique position to answer this question. The Tolstoy family was one of the oldest and most respected families in the Russian Empire. They had held an influential position in the government, dating back to the time of Ivan the Terrible. Therefore, to find out what the movers and shakers at the Decembrist period thought of the events, he often didn't have to move beyond his own family tree. He had access not only to a number of powerful relatives to interview both formally and informally, but he also had access to family archives, journals, and letters that would reveal things that interviews could not. People are often impressed with how well Tolstoy captures the period of War and Peace. It's a testament both to his incredible talent as a writer and also to the incredible amount of primary source material he had access to. The more people Tolstoy interviewed, the more letters and articles about the Decembrists he read, the more he realized that there was something wrong with his initial question. He realized that trying to understand the Decembrist uprising by studying the Decembrist uprising was a bit like trying to learn math by memorizing answers rather than learning formulas. he began to notice a pattern in the memoirs and recollections of the Decembrists. A good deal of them were loyal soldiers in the Tsarist army who had been proud to defend the monarchy against the French in 1812. But then something had happened in the interim period between the start of the Napoleonic invasion and the death of Alexander I. When Napoleon's Grande Armée had been destroyed in the invasion of Russia, naturally the Russian army followed them back to Paris in order to occupy the French capital and secure their victory. What they found when they arrived was a city unlike anything they had dreamed of in Russia. When you start reading War and Peace, one of the first things you notice is the extent to which the Russian upper classes had adopted French culture. A good deal of aristocrats in St. Petersburg spoke better French than Russian. Following the French Revolution and the rise of Napoleon, a large number of former French aristocrats fled to St. Petersburg and recounted with horror the atrocities that had come with the toppling of the monarchy. You may recall moments from the opening scene of War and Peace in Anna Pavlovna's soiree, where Napoleon is said to be no less than the Antichrist himself. You may also recall that the only person who questions this is Pierre Bezukhov, who until recently had been studying in Switzerland. In other words, the only person who had actually been to Western Europe and seen the revolution firsthand who wasn't a French aristocrat who lost everything was the only one who questioned the horror stories about Napoleon in France. Keeping this in mind, you can imagine the shock of the Russian officers upon arriving in the lands formerly occupied by Napoleon. Since again, nearly all of them spoke French, they were able to communicate with the locals and see for themselves the effect the French Revolution and its Enlightenment ideas had brought to the various countries of Western Europe. Rather than finding a war-ravaged Paris full of people begging for the return of the monarchy, they found a modern, bustling metropolis full of people that were by and large living far more comfortably than the average citizen of St. Petersburg. They found common people with rights that even they as aristocrats lacked. They found new ideas that created a more compassionate, more efficient society, and they found a system of law and order that treated everyone from prince to pauper as equals. In short, they found a society worth fighting for. Having realized this, Tolstoy shifted the action of his novel back 15 years, putting his book on the Decembrists on hold after realizing that it would be impossible to write about the Decembrists without first explaining the implication of Napoleon's invasion and how the events of 1812 fundamentally changed the people who lived through them. And that's how War and Peace started. Vestiges of his original plan still exist in the novel. It's heavily implied in one of the epilogues, for example, that Pierre and the young Nikolai Bolkonsky go on to become Decembrists. Tolstoy's original question, why did the Decembrists do what they did when it seems totally irrational, was modified, but it still forms what I consider the soul of the novel. War and Peace is in many ways a case study in human behavior, but the conclusion Tolstoy reaches is that the human being is largely irrational, unexplainable, and his behavior is mostly governed by external events. Because looking back at the conflict in a vacuum, a lot of things don't really make much sense. Napoleon's sworn enemy from the day he took power to the day he was exiled for a second time was Great Britain. Yet he invaded Russia, a country that he had no serious quarrel with, and one whom he expressed admiration for a number of times. Two of some of the largest armies in human history squared off against one another, and the one won by destroying and surrendering its ancient capital and largest city. Napoleon knew that the only way he'd be able to save his army was by hunkering down in Moscow and rationing supplies over the winter, but his army rampaged through the streets anyway and ruined any chance of its own survival. You can bring up things like the continental system and the importance of demonstrating his authority to his numerous client states and the fundamentals of guerrilla warfare and yada yada yada, but these don't really give a complete answer to why things happened the way they did. I'm going to restrain myself here because a lot of Tolstoy's commentary about determinism routinely gets ripped to shreds by academia, but to me it forms the single most fundamental part of the novel. You're free to believe whatever you want to. Although according to Tolstoy, you're perhaps not as free as you might think. I hope this video inspires at least one person to pick up War and Peace and give it a shot. Despite how intimidating it might be because of its length, it remains a profoundly interesting, profoundly readable, and surprisingly modern story. Because at the end of the day, empires rise and empires fall, but human beings remain the same weirdos that they've always been.